Snow drifted across the Korean hills like ashes from a dying fire. On a cold April morning in 1951, a U.S. Army jeep pulled up to the headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur. A messenger stepped out, saluted, and handed him a letter from Washington. Inside, a single sentence changed history. President Harry S. Truman had relieved the most famous general in America of his command. MacArthur read it silently. Then, with the same composure he had worn on every battlefield, he folded the paper and looked toward the East China Sea. "So," he murmured, "this is how empire repays loyalty." For decades, Douglas MacArthur had stood as the embodiment of victory itself. The conqueror of the Pacific, the liberator of the Philippines, the man who ruled post-war Japan like a benevolent emperor. To millions, he was the closest thing to a living god America had ever produced. His name carried the weight of legend, his confidence the gravity of destiny. But somewhere between glory and obedience, he crossed a line. In Korea, when orders came to hold the line, he wanted to march to the Yalu. When Truman sought limited war, MacArthur demanded total victory, even nuclear escalation. He no longer followed policy. He defined it. And for that, he was dismissed. As his plane lifted from Tokyo toward the United States, he looked down upon the islands he had once sworn to defend and said to his aide, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Yet the truth is, Douglas MacArthur never faded. His shadow still haunts every conversation about military power, civilian control, and the peril of men who believe they are indispensable. This is not the story of a general. It is the story of a man who won every war except the one against himself. Douglas MacArthur was the kind of figure history rarely forgets. Brilliant, disciplined, visionary, and dangerously convinced of his own infallibility. He lived as if the world itself were a stage built for his triumphs, a place where rules existed to be rewritten by destiny. To his admirers, he was the soldier-statesman who defended freedom across the Pacific, rebuilt a defeated Japan into a democracy, and embodied the very essence of American resolve. To his critics, he was a man intoxicated by power, a general who mistook divine purpose for command authority, and in doing so, threatened the very foundation of civilian control over the military. The story of Douglas MacArthur is not simply about war or victory. It is about hubris, the moment when conviction turns into certainty and certainty into defiance. It is about how a man who swore absolute loyalty to his country came to see himself as its moral compass. In the end, his legacy asks one haunting question. What happens when a hero becomes too great for the system that created him? The answer lies not in the medals on his chest, but in the silence that followed his last salute. Douglas MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880, in Little Rock, Arkansas, into a family where the military was not a profession but a birthright. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had been a Civil War hero, awarded the Medal of Honor at just 17. His mother, Mary Pinckney Hardy MacArthur, was fiercely ambitious for her son. From childhood, Douglas was taught that greatness was not optional. It was inherited. He grew up on remote frontier bases, among soldiers and bugles, where uniforms carried the smell of dust and pride. At West Point, he excelled beyond expectation, graduating first in his class in 1903. His brilliance was matched by arrogance, and even his peers whispered that MacArthur's true uniform was not khaki, but destiny itself. During World War I, as a young officer in France, he led the 42nd Rainbow Division, with flair and fearlessness, earning 7 Silver Stars. He believed courage was theater, that the sight of a commander standing tall under fire was worth more than 1,000 rifles. It worked. His troops adored him, and Washington took notice. Between wars, he served as superintendent of West Point, reforming its curriculum, then rose to Army Chief of Staff under President Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. But his strict sense of order sometimes collided with democratic reality. When impoverished World War I veterans, the Bonus Army, marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of their bonuses, MacArthur personally led troops to disperse them, burning their camps. The images shocked the nation. It was an omen of the man he would become, decisive, unapologetic, convinced that discipline outweighed sentiment. In 1935, he was sent to the Philippines to help organize their defense forces. There, surrounded by palm trees and adoration, he began crafting a personal myth, the noble defender of Asia. When World War II reached the Pacific, Japan's invasion forced him to flee. But his last words from Corregidor echoed around the world. "I shall return." And he did. 3 years later, MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his promise and sealing his legend. But legends, once born, no longer belong to reality. They demand perfection. And MacArthur, believing himself chosen, would never again accept limits set by any mortal authority. By 1945, Douglas MacArthur was not merely a general. He was an institution. His return to the Philippines had transformed him from soldier to symbol. Newspapers called him the Caesar of the Pacific. His photographs, pipe in mouth, cap tilted, sunglasses fixed, became icons of victory itself. When Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, MacArthur stood tall on the deck, reading his speech with the authority of a man who seemed to embody the nation's triumph. "We have had our last chance," he declared. "If we do not now devise some greater system, Armageddon will be at our door." He was no longer talking only about Japan. He was speaking about civilization. After the war, President Truman appointed him Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, effectively placing the entire Japanese nation under his rule. From a Tokyo office overlooking the ruins of the Imperial Palace, MacArthur governed 80 million people. He rewrote Japan's constitution, dismantled its military, restructured its economy, and oversaw the establishment of democratic institutions. To many Japanese citizens, he was both conqueror and liberator, the blue-eyed shogun. To Americans, he was proof that one man's will could rebuild a fallen empire. But power has a gravitational pull, and soon MacArthur's authority began to orbit itself. He refused most oversight from Washington, insisting he understood Asia better than any politician in the capital. His staff became fiercely loyal, almost devotional. His headquarters, GHQ Tokyo, operated as a miniature government with MacArthur at its center. He surrounded himself with intellectuals, generals, and advisors who reinforced his worldview, that democracy could be engineered through discipline, and that America's destiny lay in shaping the East. His belief in divine mission hardened. "God has guided me," he told reporters, "as surely as he guided Moses." Meanwhile, in Washington, Truman's administration grew wary. Reports from the Pacific described a general ruling like a monarch, often ignoring directives. When Truman requested moderation in post-war Japanese trials and policies, MacArthur selectively complied, and sometimes simply didn't. Still, his popularity in the United States made him untouchable. He was a national hero, a potential presidential candidate, and to many Americans disillusioned by politics, the embodiment of purity and courage. He seemed unstoppable. But when the Korean War broke out in 1950, MacArthur would face the one adversary he could never outmaneuver: the boundary between military judgment and democratic authority. His genius would shine again, his ambition would blaze even brighter, and then, inevitably, both would consume him. June 25, 1950. The Korean peninsula erupted in fire. North Korean troops, backed by the Soviet Union, crossed the 38th parallel, storming south toward Seoul. Within days, South Korea was collapsing. The world once again faced the specter of total war. From Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur, now 70 years old, was summoned to lead United Nations forces. For Truman, appointing him was both obvious and dangerous. MacArthur was the most capable commander alive, but also the least controllable. Within weeks, the general proved his brilliance. While the world expected a desperate defense, MacArthur devised one of the most daring maneuvers in modern warfare: the Incheon landing. On September 15, 1950, as typhoon winds battered the Korean coast, he executed a massive amphibious assault behind enemy lines. The gamble worked. Seoul was recaptured in days, and the North Korean army disintegrated. America erupted in celebration. Headlines screamed, "MacArthur does it again." The old soldier was a hero once more. But victory soon became temptation. Truman's initial order was simple: repel the invasion and restore the 38th parallel. MacArthur saw a grander vision, a unified Korea, free from communism. "There is no substitute for victory," he declared. To him, containment was cowardice. As his forces pushed north, Washington grew uneasy. Intelligence warned that China might intervene if UN troops approached the Yalu River. MacArthur dismissed it as bluff. In his mind, Asian communism was a disease to be eradicated, not quarantined. Then, on a frozen night in November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu. It was a catastrophe. UN forces were driven into retreat. Seoul fell again. The dream of total victory turned into the nightmare of endless war. In the chaos, MacArthur's frustration hardened into defiance. He sent cables to Congress and the press criticizing Truman's half measures. In March 1951, he wrote a public letter to House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, openly challenging the president's authority. There is no substitute for victory. It was an act of insubordination heard around the world. For Truman, it was the breaking point. He could tolerate arrogance, not insurrection. On April 11, 1951, the president relieved MacArthur of his command. "I fired him," Truman said, "because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president." The backlash was volcanic. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome. Parades filled the streets, millions greeted him as the wronged patriot. When he addressed Congress, the chamber stood for 30 minutes in thunderous applause. His final words became immortal. "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." But behind the applause, America had crossed its own line. The nation had witnessed a constitutional crisis disguised as a farewell. For the first time, a general's popularity had nearly eclipsed the president's power. MacArthur believed he was dismissed for speaking truth. Truman believed he had saved democracy from military rule. Both men were right, and both would pay a price. For the general, it was exile from relevance. For the president, it was a storm of political fury that nearly destroyed his career. The Korean War raged on. No victory, no peace, just stalemate. The perfect metaphor for what MacArthur had become. A man too great to follow orders and too proud to admit that even greatness must obey something higher than itself. MacArthur's dismissal was not just the end of a career. It was a reckoning between two competing visions of power in the American Republic. One saw leadership as destiny, the other as duty bound by law. From a military standpoint, Truman's decision was sound. By early 1951, the Korean front had stabilized, but the Chinese counteroffensive had turned the war into a quagmire. The president and the Joint Chiefs sought to negotiate a limited peace to contain communism without igniting World War III. MacArthur, however, envisioned total victory. He proposed airstrikes on Chinese bases, a naval blockade, even the potential use of atomic bombs. To him, anything less was appeasement. The logic of his argument was seductive. End the war swiftly, destroy the enemy decisively, and protect democracy by force. But Truman understood the deeper danger, that MacArthur's strategy risked triggering a direct confrontation with China and the Soviet Union, both nuclear-capable powers. The result could have been millions dead and another global conflict. By defying the chain of command, MacArthur inadvertently forced the nation to confront a question that haunts every democracy at war. Who commands whom? The general or the elected leader? The Constitution was unambiguous. The president is commander-in-chief. Yet public opinion was not. Polls showed nearly 70% of Americans sided with MacArthur. Truman was burned in effigy. His approval rating sank to 22%, the lowest of any sitting president at the time. But time would vindicate him. In 1952, the Senate's special hearings on MacArthur's removal revealed the full extent of his defiance. He had sent unauthorized communications to Congress, publicly contradicted presidential policy, and disregarded directives from the Joint Chiefs. The hearings concluded that while his patriotism was unquestionable, his understanding of civilian control was dangerously flawed. Strategically, the firing restored a critical precedent: civilian supremacy over the military. It reaffirmed that generals, however brilliant, serve policy. They do not make it. Without that line, America risked becoming the very empire it had fought to defeat. Globally, the consequences were profound. The Korean War remained a stalemate, but the United States avoided a nuclear confrontation and preserved the fragile balance of power in Asia. Truman's caution, derided at the time, became the model for later presidents navigating Cold War crises, measured restraint over reckless bravado. For MacArthur, exile was both punishment and prophecy. He warned Congress that America had entered an age of weakness through compromise. Yet history would show that his uncompromising vision might have led not to strength, but to annihilation. In the end, Truman's unpopular decision preserved the very principle that makes democracy resilient, that even its greatest heroes must answer to something greater than themselves, the will of the people, expressed through law. Douglas MacArthur's brilliance was never in doubt. His judgment, however, was another matter. Throughout his long career, the line between courage and ego often blurred, and sometimes vanished completely. Years before Korea, his reputation for independence had already drawn fire. In 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression, he commanded troops that violently dispersed the Bonus Army, thousands of destitute World War I veterans who had marched on Washington, demanding early payment of their service bonuses. The sight of soldiers advancing against their own brothers in arms, with bayonets fixed and tear gas rolling through the streets, horrified the nation. MacArthur defended his actions as discipline. Critics called it betrayal. His years in the Philippines were equally divided between triumph and controversy. When Japan invaded in 1941, MacArthur's failure to anticipate the assault on Clark Field allowed the enemy to cripple American air power within hours. He was forced to retreat to Corregidor. Yet his dramatic promise, "I shall return," transformed defeat into prophecy. It was the beginning of the MacArthur myth, failure repackaged as destiny. After World War II, during his occupation of Japan, he ruled with an authority few generals had ever possessed. While his reforms modernized the nation, critics accused him of authoritarian paternalism, a benevolent dictator in all but name. His relationship with Emperor Hirohito, respectful yet controlling, was hailed by some as diplomacy and condemned by others as theater. In the Korean War, his defiance of presidential policy became the final scandal, but not the last. The Senate hearings of 1951 exposed secret communications, political ambitions, and moments of manipulation that contradicted his public image of moral clarity. Evidence suggested that MacArthur had communicated privately with Republican leaders about his disagreements with Truman, blurring the line between soldier and statesman. Even after his dismissal, controversy clung to him. Some saw him as a martyr silenced by weak politicians, others as a Caesar-in-waiting who might have endangered democracy itself. Behind the glamour of his pipe and sunglasses was a man haunted by contradiction, a disciplined visionary unable to discipline himself. When asked years later if he regretted defying Truman, MacArthur smiled and said, "History will decide who was right." It did, and its verdict remains unresolved.